Silicon Valley rely completely on sort of there being a supply of hyperentities around it. Once somebody's had the idea, it's very easy then typically for it to be copied and for other people to sort of act on it. I'm very interested in this, what I call vision papers. So when people do sketch out, molecular assemblers, or they do sketch out quantum computers or whatnot, those papers do often read quite strangely, and they sort of stick out a little bit in the scientific literature. They're not normal science. They're proposing some imaginary future object and saying it will have these properties. The difference between now and 2020 in terms of possibility of AGI is not that large, but the difference in belief is absolutely enormous.
Okay, so today's guest is Michael Nielsen. Michael is a scientist and a writer, I think maybe best known for his work on open science, quantum computing, and tools for thought. He's been a leading voice in, I think, reimagining how science is done in this age. And Michael, you have this like really broad background and scope of things that you worked on, obviously. And I do love reading your blog. It's a very broad range of writing. And I think in this conversation, what would be real interesting is like exploring and connecting much of all these various topics that you've written on to this idea of existential hope and just like positive futures in general. So maybe we just dive in, and I think start with one of the central concepts that when I found it in your work, I thought was just this real interesting way of putting it, which is this concept of a hyperentity. Could you maybe explain how you came up with that concept and dive into what it is a little bit? Like, it's not just like a meme or something, for example.
Sure. Actually, it's funny. It's a little bit embarrassing. So I wrote this long piece, 40,000 words, about how to be optimistic in the face of artificial superintelligence. And that's a very heartfelt, very serious piece from my point of view, really mattered to me. But there is this little rant in the middle of it about these hyperentities, and it was just expressing sort of irritation. And I've been a little bit surprised, shocked even. A lot of people have told me that actually that's the piece of the essay that they responded to. It's this kind of an aside from my point of view. But it's really, it's riffing on some older notions, which I didn't feel quite were the right term for what I just wanted a term for an imagined future object, some sort of hypothetical future object. So artificial superintelligence or quantum computing, or in the past, you might have had things like actually universal programmable computers or heavier than air flying machines were sort of examples of from the past where somebody has imagined a future entity. And that has then sort of served as essentially sort of a design goal. And I'm particularly interested in the question of, or sort of the aspect that I'm interested in, is in some sense the extent to which imagination was required to do the sort of the design work. It's not, I don't know, a notion like a universal programmable computer seems very obvious today because our culture carries it. But at the time, it was a shock and required enormous imagination and enormous understanding to come up with. And that's sort of those are the connotations that I was particularly interested in carrying. Oh, actually, a good one for the Foresight Institute, which is associated with many. But I think in particular, one of the founders of the Foresight Institute, Eric Drexler, has this notion of molecular assembler. And that's a great example. Of something that required a lot of depth of understanding and imagination to come up with, but after the fact seems pretty obvious. It's not just Eric who did that, but I mean, people like, I guess Heinlein and Feynman are sometimes given sort of partial credit, but together, sort of this group of people had this very deep insight, and then it serves as kind of an orienting vision. Sorry, it's a very long answer, but it's kind of not a context.
I think the only thing that I would have heard someone say similarly is like a future artifact or something almost. Like that's something that when we've done workshops on world building and these sort of things, it's something that seems like the term that most.
Sure. I guess there's a couple of other terms. I mean, Bruce Sterling has this nice term spime, which he uses to mean something quite similar. It's got a little bit more it's an object which has a lot of knowledge about itself. Nick Land has this term hyperstition, it's kind of an alternative to the term superstition. It's sort of a short phrase for self-fulfilling prophecy, something which becomes so attractive to existing institutions that it then sort of forces itself into existence. But those terms, they're slightly different in the sense of the connotations or the particular focus there. Although they're talking about future entities, they're not really talking about the particular actions that you do with them. I'm interested in sort of the way in which these kind of entities, they tend to carry new verbs with them. So the idea of a programmable computer, the idea that you specify a set of instructions, and a molecular assembler will be able to build any type of material object within, there's going to be some parameters, but very, very broad. So you sort of have these new kinds of verbs or affordances in the design terminology. So it's very much sort of a design point of view.
What was the first term you said there? Spine?
SPIME. That's
Spine?
from the science fiction author Bruce Sterling. In fact, it wasn't in a science fiction book he wrote it. He wrote it in what was it? I can't remember. It's like a long essay about really sort of the design of sort of in the Internet of Things was kind of the context. It's quite a nice term, but it doesn't seem to have really caught on. I've heard a few people use it, but yeah.
Not like hyperentity, apparently. That's the one that can. Well, I think that if I don't remember correctly also, or if I remember correctly from your post, it was also, you were sort of suggesting that maybe Silicon Valley tends to undervalue hyperentities. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I mean, undervalue, not exactly. I mean, they rely completely on sort of there being a supply of hyperentities, just the way in which the economy works of Silicon Valley. There's no way of building a moat around it. Once somebody's had the idea, it's very easy then typically for it to be copied and for other people to sort of act on it. So typically it's coming from other parts of the world, academia and art and sort of the penumbra around them. I sometimes talk about para-academia. Those tend to be places where these ideas come from. Actually, the examples I gave before, molecular assemblers and artificial superintelligence and universal computers, they all come out of academia or the little area around. There's examples like, say, virtual reality, which actually comes much more out of the artistic community. What's going on there is that sort of the economy, so to speak, in those cases, it's a reputation economy, which is built around citation or attribution of ideas. And so somebody like David Deutsch, you can really build a reputation and a career around an idea like quantum computing. But the economy in Silicon Valley works differently. It's around equity and around sort of ownership of the means of production. And so you sort of have these two different systems that are coupled in some way. Sort of the ideas coming out of academia are often used as almost sort of a feedstock for Silicon Valley. But it is, I think, somewhat separate. The way I tend to think of it is that often in Silicon Valley, ideas they're very instrumentally useful and understanding, but they're done in service of whatever the product and whatever the market is. Whereas in academia, and also to some extent in a slightly different way in the artistic world, the ideas and the understanding are fundamental. That's the object. That's what you're actually trying to do. And your ability to sort of execute, to build the apparatus or whatever it is, that's a secondary thing. That's instrumental to sort of the fundamental goal, which is to obtain that understanding, to obtain the deep new ideas. So you have these two, as I think of them as two coupled economies, fairly weakly coupled, like they both have their own reasons for existing. And I don't want to get into any, sometimes people will say, oh, you're sort of making a judgment. My personality is such that I'm happier in the sort of the artistic scientific realm. But of course, the world is made up of things which come out of the other realm. So they're both very, very important.
Yeah, we had Ed Finn on, who was the editor of the Hieroglyph book that came out, where they like connected scientists with sci-fi authors to like try to come up with scientific artifacts, I guess, like future artifacts. Do you think, like, do you see sci-fi as a potential tool for like hyperentities, or do you think that it's like maybe too cliche?
I mean, historically, people love to point to the example of Arthur C. Clarke and satellites, geosynchronous satellites, which actually wasn't his idea, although he popularized it. And there are a few examples. I constantly find Vernor Vinge, the science fiction author, really remarkably prescient in how he viewed the future. I think I actually see almost more connection to design than to science fiction. Sort of this idea of developing new classes of object with new types of action, new types of interface. Is I sort of think of it as more a meld of scientific understanding and that. The fact is, I mean, nature is just so much more imaginative than we are. And so a lot of the most remarkable things that have been discovered, you think of, I don't know, general relativity or superconductivity or ideas like this, the fact that light is an excitation of the electromagnetic field, like these are mind-boggling facts, just utterly shocking, so much more interesting and surprising than anything a human being has ever sort of imagined de novo. So in that sense, I think you actually sort of need that marriage of very deep insight into how the world works with, again, sort of a design point of view. And science fiction writers to some extent have that. So of course do designers, but the science fiction writers themselves, I think, often don't have quite enough sort of depth of insight into the world. They're stuck recycling ideas that they've seen, often very effectively, and they can sort of see all sorts of interesting consequences. It's not quite the same as invention.
Yeah. Do you think that there should be more like conscious effort, for example, from Silicon Valley in trying to like design hyperentities or like come up with new ones to generate excitement or like a direction?
Really, I mean, they're doing what they do. I don't know. I think about actually a good example. I forget which lab it was. Palmer Luckey, the founder of Oculus, was in, I think it was at USC, a basic sort of science lab that was fairly basic science lab that was just doing experimentation with sort of very simple prototype VR systems. And so that's, in my opinion, an example of sort of the supply chain working reasonably well. You've got this fundamental work being done, which in its own way doesn't need any justification, but in practice, it does feed in. There's always this sort of interesting friction between the two worlds because they have two such different fundamental objectives. But I don't think particularly Silicon Valley needs to change what it's doing there. There is this, I suppose, this sort of interesting question about public goods production, which is that the nature of ideas and understanding is that they most naturally want to be public goods. That's in many ways best for our society. I don't know, it frustrates me a little bit to imagine, what's in the internal mailing lists of companies like Google and Facebook and Microsoft, and actually for that matter now, companies like OpenAI and Anthropic. There must be just an astounding amount of understanding that is hidden there that would be tremendously valuable if it was made public for the world, but is going to be forever lost. I'll bet that most of what we know about distributed systems is basically hidden inside old Google mailing lists, but it's not in the company's interest necessarily to be releasing that. So that's one sort of point of frustration, but I think it's intrinsic to the situation. Actually, the companies do have a lot of vested interest in keeping that stuff private, unfortunately. I don't know how to solve that design problem.
Yeah, I think on the Palmer Luckey point, I heard him say that he got all his best ideas for like weapons because he works on that now from sci-fi, which is interesting, and like maybe not the way that I was hoping people like get excited from reading sci-fi, but yeah, that's why I feel like with the hyperentities term, there is something in terms of like if we actually want to think about how we can steer towards like not just a future but like a better future, that there seems to be something in terms of like we should maybe put more effort into how we design the hyper entities that actually end up having like obviously it's like a very complex and random thing maybe what becomes the hyper entity.
Yeah, it is a bit strange. And this is actually, I suppose, connected to Nick Land's point about hyperstition, the extent to which different things become popular or become sort of seen as targets. So in some sense, the difference between now and 2020 in terms of possibility of AGI is not that large. But the difference in belief is absolutely enormous. And I think about, say, pick a sort of a parallel world. I don't know, cryonics, say. You imagine that sort of the same degree of belief and capital had sort of been infused there. What would that field look like now? It would look probably very, very different. So you still have people sort of working on it, but just not at the same scale. You don't have thousands of people sort of coming into, I don't know, Hayes Valley or wherever trying to work on this. So that degree of sort of belief and self-fulfilling prophecy is actually pretty important. And it's weird. It's a little bit random. Certainly it's it's so influenced by single actors. If tomorrow, somebody comes out and announces that they don't think that OpenAI should have a down round. Some very important investor who participated in prior rounds, that would have a very large impact, and it's potentially just down to sort of decisions by a few people. Don't want this to happen, but if Taiwan was invaded, and again that decision can just be made by a small handful of people, that would also have sort of an enormous impact on this degree of belief. So it's sort of funny how that works.
Yeah, it's hard to steer, I guess, or like hard to design ahead.
Well, it does seem to it's certainly possible to steer, but it's just so dependent on sort of contingent actions by um, uh, it's some interesting combination of sort of power and sort of truth is important there. Power does matter a lot in the short term. Truth matters, I think, more over the long term. If AGI is not going to happen through anything remotely related to LLMs, then you can pour as many, trillions of dollars into it, and it doesn't matter. That's just a fact about the world. I'm not saying it's true, but I'm saying that that's a potential way the world is. Sort of make 2 + 2 = 5 for a while with enough money, so to speak. But over the long term, reality wins.
That's true. Reality. Wait, like my last question on the hyper entities point, I
Yeah.
think would be, because obviously I think AGI is like the hyper entity of the moment, at least in, our sphere maybe. But are there any other ones that you're personally excited about, or that if you think about like what would bring potentially the most value to the world, what would be such?
I mean, it's interesting you say that it's of the moment. I mean, in some sense, renewable energy is actually still more important. I think it's fossil fuels are roughly a $3 trillion industry, much, much, much larger than what is conventionally called tech. And so the ability to replace that by something else is, in some sense, sort of more important. And the idea sort of cheap photovoltaic power and cheap batteries remain these kind of orienting visions they have been for decades, although I think probably a lot of people didn't really, some people still don't believe in those. Actually, just to go back, can I get you to repeat the exact phrasing of the question?
Oh, I think the question is just like, are there any other hyper entities that we
I,
should, that you think would be most valuable actually right now?
So certainly, I am very interested in and excited by sort of design mechanisms for solving public goods problems and collective action problems. So ideas like assurance contracts, Alex Tabarrok's idea of dominant assurance contracts, the Victory Groves mechanism, for which Glenn File and Zoe Hittig and Vitalik Buterin have been working on with quadratic funding. These sorts of ideas are very interesting. If you can solve the public goods problem or collective action problems, that's like just totally transformative for civilization. It's probably related to, it's not the same as, but these centuries old dreams of global governance working, and we've never really figured out how to do that. We've sort of made some, I suppose, things like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Vienna and Montreal protocols are very important progress. That seems somehow related, but gosh, our governance mechanisms seem primitive.
Actually, I think it's a really interesting point because when with the existential hope program, I've done a lot of workshops and stuff on what future people want to see, and then also like what do you think is the biggest blocker? And I think a really common theme is just like human nature, or these sort of things. And so yeah.
So last year I read Tom Holland's book, Dominion, which is, you can describe it in many ways, but to some extent it's a history of kindness. It's a history of charity. And he's particularly interested in the question of what influence did the Christian tradition have on our modern notions of what it means to be a good person. And he claims, I think sort of fairly plausibly, that in fact they really contributed a lot to people valuing kindness and valuing charity. Obviously, people selfishly value kindness. We like it when other people are kind to us, but they don't necessarily hold it up as one of the chief virtues. And he sort of will claim that ideas like, turn the other cheek and love thy neighbor as thyself, which come out of the Christian Gospels, that one of the most important impacts of Christianity has been to really amplify those ideas, not just in the Christian world, but in fact in the secular world. He traces how it really incredibly influenced the Enlightenment and also other cultures. So you can go to many very non-Christian countries, and they actually hold sort of views about kindness and charity that Holland claims can be traced back to the Gospels. So I think that kind of thing, that's, I don't know, describing it as a social technology is kind of a bit silly. What's the right way of thinking about it? It's something like, it is very interesting the extent to which those notions are constructed out of stories. They're constructed out of myth and transformative for civilization. I don't know that you can get things like human rights. I'm reading about history of human rights at the moment. I don't know that you can get things like human rights and sort of the modern, the suffragette movement and the Civil Rights Act and things like that without those.
Yeah, I feel like I feel you can almost think about them as like social technologies. I think it's especially interesting now, or it becomes very evident in terms of like, this is what we want to instill in our AIs now, or like we want to make sure that this is.
Yeah.
we have takeoff with these values, not other values, or like, it's
Yeah.
well, so I think that a lot of your writing is about this. You're obviously very excited about technology, which I think, at Foresight, we're obviously very excited about technology, and like that we could, if you read Drexler's Engines of Creation back in the 80s, it's like all these exciting things that we could do. But then there's also like the point of all these very scary things that also could be achieved with these technologies. And you wrote the post on how to be a wise optimist, is the term,
Yeah.
about technology.
Yep.
Could you maybe help us unpack a bit what that means to you, and also why it's important, maybe?
Sure. I suppose I was just sort of amused almost by the growing use of the term optimism in discussions about technology and the future of technology, and what seemed like a very bad misuse. If you're a patient goes to see your doctor and you're diagnosed with cancer, the optimistic path isn't to ignore it and to pretend it's not happening and to continue on about your life and just hoping that somehow spontaneously it will go into remission. The optimistic path is to really take it on board and not to get depressed. That would be the path of pessimism, but it would be to take it on board and to ask, what can I do about this situation? And so a lot of sort of what passes for optimism in tech seems to me like a foolish optimism, where it's like, no, we're not going to listen. We're not going to think at all about the problems that these AGIs could cause. In fact, it's actually quite pessimistic. It relies on you believing that they're not going to be particularly capable. If you look at the people who believe that they're going to be the most capable, they're the most optimistic about capabilities, they are the people who are actually the most worried. So sort of the actual optimists, in some sense, about capabilities are very worried. They're the people who are facing up to the fact that there is this sort of very difficult diagnosis. And I think that the optimistic response, the wisely optimistic response, is to ask, what can we do about it? That doesn't mean you're necessarily going to find an answer. It may be terminal, but at least you can engage seriously with the actual state of affairs, do your darndest to find positive things to do. It doesn't mean that you need a solution, but even just the ability to start working on tiny little things is...
That's actually, that's really true, that the ones that are the most optimistic about these technologies are also the most scared, or like it's like the transhumanist point, or I feel like that's definitely an observation that I've made, that people that are like the people that almost started thinking about all these existential risk stuff, like Nick Bostrom or like Anders Sandberg, or these people, they were transhumanists that got like really, really excited about the future, and then they were like, oh, wait, what if all these things get in the way of making that future happen? And so I feel like that's how we ended up here. Yeah, I think that it's really interesting also because there's the point of like you're almost like shooting yourself in the foot if you don't take into consideration the potential downsides of these technologies as well, because you probably might get a lot of opposing views against you, basically.
Well, I mean, always in sort of history, the first jet airliners, a lot of them crashed. That problem needed to be solved. In fact, de Havilland went out of business because of it with their Comet. And I mean, there's so many examples like that. The early refrigerators leaked ammonia gas and killed people. They actually needed to replace it. They replaced it, funnily enough, by chlorofluorocarbons, which was a big step up. It didn't immediately kill people, but of course, it did have this other problem, and sort of that pattern of actually be honest about the problems and figure out how to fix them is foundational for existential hope.
Yeah. I think that I think it was in this same post you also write about, the fact that advances in science and these things, well, that's what brings us closer to the truth, or like we know more about the world, but truth is like dual use. Is that still your take? Like, and does that mean we want to get as close to the truth as possible, or what? Because I think, for example, if you think about the existential hope point, when I ask people what is like the most existential hope future you can imagine, it's often like knowing or learning as much about the universe as possible is one of the, I think, most common things that people will say. But yeah, what's your take on that as like our ultimate goal?
I don't know. I suppose that seems a little too Pollyanna to me. Certainly the way I look at, a good example, I mean, I spent much of my career as a quantum physicist, and, there's this sort of astounding set of of ideas from about 1900 to 1925, 1926 were developed, which is, it's the most fundamental things about the way the universe works. And it's very important then for later things, if we want to understand proteins or DNA or modern semiconductors and so many other modern material science. But it's also part of what led to the understanding of nuclear physics that resulted in nuclear weaponry. And I don't think you don't really get that a la carte, unfortunately. It's all or nothing. There's no, once you've got quantum mechanics, you're going to get all of those things. And this seems to be, it's just an empirical observation. I can't really prove it, but so often sort of any deep understanding of reality ends up having both many positive uses and many negative uses. I think there's something funny going on where I don't really understand quite why this is, this sort of intrinsically dual use nature of deep understanding. But I mean, a really nice example, there's this famous declaration by the mathematician Hardy that he couldn't think of anything more useless and more beautiful than number theory, which is much of what he'd spent his time sort of working on. And then, I mean, not that long after his death, GCHQ and the NSA discovered that number theory could be used to develop cryptographic systems that, have all these sort of interesting military and other applications. He was kind of wrong. You took even the most apparently useless sort of set of ideas that seems very beautiful, but very disconnected from human reality. And it turns out it's actually very connected to human reality. Gosh, I mean, much of the reason for the NSA and whatnot's funding of quantum computing is because they want to be able to break these codes based on funny facts about factoring of large numbers into their prime factors. Hardy, I don't know what he would have made of it, but again, it's just like, these very deep facts somehow then show up in very mundane concerns in very important ways, and sometimes in very dangerous.
It's definitely dangerous.
It's pretty strange, actually. I mean, you see this so much. There's sort of thousands of examples like this. Every once in a while, I'll see the Riemann zeta function in an unusual place or things like this. It's just these things that seem so obscure and so disconnected, and they turn out eventually to be very important in the everyday world.
Well, I guess there's something very, it's easy to get excited about that, or it is nice when you're able to make connections and connect the dots. And as a human and expanding, maybe, the Star Trek vision, for example, seems like the most exciting vision that I feel like anyone has been able to come up with so far, at least that the most people I've talked to can get behind.
Uh-huh.
And that's so much about just continuing to discover the universe and so on.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have not watched Star Trek. I've watched probably a tiny handful of episodes. I think only from the original series have I watched a single complete episode. Something that's funny about a lot of these visions, they're often a bit strange from sort of an emotional point of view, or an artistic point of view. They often don't. I made this point before about the spread of kindness as something to be valued and as something that then eventually gets built into sort of governance. And I think you often don't see so much of that kind of thinking going into visions of the future. Like, what other sort of fundamental emotional stances will people sort of create and start to spread? And I don't have an answer to that question. I'm just pointing out that a notion like, love your neighbor as yourself is a shockingly imaginative idea to have and then to spread and evangelize, and sort of just wondering sort of what other ideas like that, which have to do with this sort of, I mean, that's a case of basic stance towards the other. Actually, I suppose, some sort of modern ideas about veganism and, who should be treated as a moral patient and these kinds of questions, those are obviously very interesting and whatnot. But I think notions around identity are likely to fracture an awful lot in coming years. They're already sort of fracturing in interesting ways in human beings, but they're going to fracture a lot more. I mean, the ability to merge and refactor and change and distill out and to do all these kinds of things with artificial minds, the lack of that there's something sort of very essential about sort of the boundary around a human being, but those boundaries are just going to be utterly changed. It's going to be very hard to say what it means for there to be a boundary around them. I never quite know in the background when using Claude or whatever, am I using the same model as I was using last week? To what extent are they actually sort of slightly tweaking it all the time? And of course, there is that funny feeling I think many of us get where you keep starting new instances and it's like you're sort of starting a relationship again and again and again and again with this thing that has some human characteristics. But it's a very strange experience. It's a very human experience in some ways, but it's also a very inhuman experience. Sort of this, reset on identity over and over and over again. It's the Groundhog Day of personalities.
Yeah, I think on the values point, I think that's definitely one of it's so underexplored, basically, in especially in the current context, I think, that we're in. And I think with Foresight, you very much meet with people that are very techno-optimist, and like technology is seen as a, potential tool for a lot of these things. And I do think that there are like potential exciting applications of just like moral circle expansion. Also a lot of challenges, obviously, but through new ways of being able to communicate, like neurotechnologies and these sort of things, which is interesting. And maybe to be able to communicate with someone on just like a whole different level of sort of granularity or like nuance could be like a new moral revolution or something like that. That would be best possible outcome.
Certainly seems like it'll be, well, I'm not sure it'll necessarily be best, but it'll certainly be an expansion and sort of a change in really interesting and challenging ways.
Yeah, I think that unless you have anything else to say on that, I'll jump to another point, which is a bit like the existential hope.
Actually, can I just mention one thing, which is, sort of when this kind of point is made, people will very often name David Pearce's hedonistic imperative and these sorts of ideas. And I find it interesting that they always name the same example. That's often, when you sort of notice that happening in any domain, it's often like, well, actually, not much is really going on over here except that. And that's very interesting, but it doesn't indicate to me it's a little bit sort of underexplored.
Yeah, it's interesting if it's underexplored or is there nothing else there? But I do feel like there is something there.
There's no way there's nothing else there.
Yeah.
You think about, I mean, even just the way in which, I don't know, capitalism has, for example, modulated our values in so many different ways, and so sort of any changes to that are going to modulate our values, I think, in very interesting ways. There's too much moral change over the last, I read a little New York Times piece from about 1905, which recorded that, I've forgotten the name, Ota Benjo, I think it was, a pygmy had been brought from Africa and was now being housed in the Bronx Zoo. And you think, and the article, it's not exactly approving, but it's not exactly shockingly disapproving either. And can you imagine that headline now? It's impossible to imagine.
Not even on the Onion,
No, yeah. It just seems ludicrous, and yet it's 100 years ago. So sort of those differences. It's funny how slow moral progress and how stop-start it seems, and yet as soon as you go sort of over 100 years, I know I'm using the term progress, kind of a Whig view of history, but there's definitely change, really big changes, and people like Martin Luther King or Gandhi or Mary Wollstonecraft and people like that are sort of make such enormous differences in the way we think.
Yeah, I was thinking about this just because I was reading a book about women working in a hotel 100 years ago, and I was like, we get to work, that was like the exciting thing then. And so, yeah, we definitely, when people mention only one example also, it is interesting, I think, with like futurism in general. I feel like this has been the case for like quite a while, or at least since I became interested in it. And when I've talked to people, like, for example, Christine, our co-founder, she's been around since, with Drexler before, so since the 80s. And it's the same things being discussed, sort of. Obviously, things will feel more like, for example, AI it feels like it's actually coming now.
Yeah.
And she said that it feels different also compared to, because they were obviously talking about nanotech in the 80s. And she said that, well, this is, we can see the progress just much more clearly now. But it is interesting, I think, with this. That's why I think that people connect to the hyper entities idea so much, because there is just like the vision for the future is a little bit outdated. I feel like some people can get behind it, and the Silicon Valley mafia doesn't really mind that type of like 80s vision of the future, but it
Yeah.
doesn't feel like it speaks very broadly to people, like
No.
more global scale. Yeah, I think that's just like, even if you prompt your LLM to like create a vision of like 2035, it's going to be, silver clothing and like white houses. And it's just like, oh, because that's how people imagined the future in the 60s or something like that.
It's something I suppose. I mean, I think. This is something where a lot of the best science fiction writers are doing really interesting things. I love Carolyn Chera, for example. She has this just beautiful ways often of thinking about identity. Cosmo Shalitzi has a really nice review, just a very short review of Chera. And it just points out that, most people think of an identity crisis as being, am I in the right job? Chera's characters, their identity crises are about, am I in the right species? Am I sentient? These kinds of questions. And it's a good description. She's very good at thinking in that kind of way and sort of just drawing it out and expanding your own consciousness of what's possible. It's something I love about some of Ted Chiang's writing, which tends to be sort of much more near future. But again, he's a person that has this very sort of expansive, in some ways, notion of what being a human being is about, or what being a sentience is about. So it sort of tends to be a bit more interesting than just being about technology. It's a funny way of putting it. I suppose I think of sort of technology as the interface between humanity and the universe. So I'm putting a lot of focus on humanity there, and not so much on the universe. It's kind of all three of those things are very interesting. I suppose maybe as a writer, you maybe need to focus a little bit on.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this writer. I feel like I have to.
Chera?
Yeah.
Carolyn Chera? Oh yeah, she won. She sort of won all the awards, and her book Sentience is, I think, probably her best known book. I've probably only read maybe 5 of her books or something, but Sentience is one of my favorite novels. It's very slow to get started. I almost gave up several times in the first 150 pages, and I've probably reread it half a dozen times now. That's a very interesting exploration of what it means to clone an identity, and sort of it explores that through multiple instances in very different ways. Quite a remarkably insightful way. Actually, her background is really interesting. She was, I believe, trained as an archaeologist, and it really gives her. She's not a technologist. She has this, instead, she's steeped in this other very deep tradition of how people enter the world. And there's also something very interesting, just sort of in the aesthetic. Well, it's more than the aesthetic, but there's something very interesting going on that I don't know enough about archaeology to understand, but you can feel it. It's like this person has a depth to them that is very, very interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. It must be like she knows what it's like to explore past civilizations at a very physical level.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know how much field work or whatever she did. In fact, I'm not even 100% sure where I got that information that she was an archaeologist, or she was trained as an archaeologist. But yes. It's very consonant with what it feels like to read her.
We'll link it on to this episode so people can explore it, myself included. Yeah, I think that actually one of the I'm gonna move us on to the next also, but just while we're on this, actually, I think my favorite sci-fi TV right now is the Murderbot series, which is available on Apple TV. Now it sounds like I'm advertising them, but I was just really excited to see something so like everyday light and like relatable in terms of sci-fi. Yeah, it was. I recommend it basically for anyone. So yeah, I think what I wanted to also make sure we have time to talk about is just, I guess it's kind of the point that it relates to what we've already touched on, I think. But I know that you wrote about like that, for example, breakthroughs like language don't necessarily come from like goal-driven processes. So it's a little bit of what we about before. And so if we're trying to think about like we want to invest very wisely for the most optimistic or like the most positive future, do you think that we should like try and engineer for like a specific outcome, or are there any like underlying systems instead that we should focus on, like tools or institutions that will like open up the possibility for positive surprises. So like, is it this very concrete ideas that we should aim for, or is it more like creating like a fertile ground of discovery that we should invest in more?
I mean, I think you need to do both those things. My personality is to prefer the more exploratory approach. I don't know. One of my favorite facts is Charles Darwin didn't go on the Beagle to do biology. He went on it he thought he was going to be doing geology with a little bit of biology on the side. Talk about sort of undirected exploration paying off. And people like, Newton didn't have a goal of inventing modern science. Like, he couldn't have. He discovered the goal. Einstein couldn't have had he didn't write a grant application to change our notions of space, time, energy, mass. He was just exploring, and sort of those are things that he discovered after the fact. So that's my personal prejudice is sort of in those directions. I love the language example that you bring up. Nobody, again, that wasn't the result of a grant application and a big push by the NIH or whoever, NSF, to do that. It's something that emerged. But by the same token, I think you said in some of the background materials you sent me before, you were pointing at things like the Apollo program as like really interesting kind of unifying visions. And of course, I suppose, really interesting way, your question is about the value of coordination versus exploration. So, if you're going to coordinate, if you want to build goals are very useful for coordinated attacks on problems. You build LIGO this way, you do the Apollo program this way, you build the LHC this way. And exploration is more sort of something which is done by individuals or small groups. Part of the reason I maybe feel passionate about defending the exploration is my sense is that the current time in history is a little bit anomalous in that the tendency of bureaucrats, the tendency of leaders is to prefer a goal-oriented approach, a very natural thing to want to do. You can make the big announcement, we're going to cure cancer and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And so you can sort of direct a lot of money in that way. Whereas sort of this undirected approach where you don't actually know what it is that is going to be found is harder to defend. It's just so much more hunch driven, and in particular sort of often in very illegible ways. So I feel like it needs a bit of a constituency a bit more. It is a bit funny that in fact we're in a situation where our society has sort of adopted that. Vannevar Bush wrote this famous memo in the United States, which led to the foundation of the National Science Foundation in the United States and a lot of sort of copies in many other countries. But one of the things that memo, I believe it's the first place that the term basic science is ever used. And that was kind of a coinage, really, as kind of a part of he was looking for a weapon to win a political argument in favor of this kind of basic undirected exploratory research. And he won that argument really comprehensively, which is, I think, why there is as much support for basic exploration as there is now. But the natural pendulum is in the other direction. That's kind of the high modernist approach, is to map out where you're going to go and whatnot. My friends Adam Marblestone and Anastasia Gamek, are running Convergent Research, which builds these focused research organizations, as you know. And they're lovely, and I am very glad they're doing that. But I don't want a future in which everything's a fro either. I think that would be bad. I think they're also very aware of that. But it's hard for like what's sort of self-limiting or self-regulating, like what sets the scale. I don't actually know. Certainly that kind of model is very attractive to political.
Yeah, I think as a funder, it's definitely very scary to fund the exploration because you may end up with nothing.
Well, in fact, it will end up with nothing almost all the time. Although, I mean, I think if you look at, as I say, sort of historic examples, how much sort of future work like that is justified by Max Planck inventing quantum mechanics, or Albert Einstein inventing general relativity, or Darwin inventing, and sort of so on and so forth, Marie Curie and radioactivity, all these kinds of things sort of deserve some, It's really this point, I suppose. David Deutsch makes it, I think, quite nicely. You can only plan, you can only set goals if you know what's out there, and yet by definition, we actually haven't seen most of the universe. We most of the sort of parameter regimes are still completely unexplored, and so you can't really plan well in those places. And yet, historically, they've been the most exciting places to go.
Yeah, I think I want to explore something that touches on this, which is you did write in. So I think to sum up that point, it feels like it's pretty clear that both are needed. Like we need the exploration that probably takes some people to fund that have the guts to do that, and we need the coordination. But I do know that in one of your posts, you actually said that maybe we should consider having like this serious discipline of imagining the future, and that could actually be really important. And so that would be a bit fun to riff on. I don't expect you to have like perfect answer, but if we actually think about doing that in practice, and I think it's.
I think, actually, can I just clarify something? I think, I mean, I meant something very specific about that. I mean, people have been imagining the future sort of seriously for, well over 100 years. I think about, I don't know, Herman Kahn and people like this, and well, many, many others. I was referring very specifically to this task of conceiving of, well, new hyperentities, in particular, sort of taking this design point of view, which says that the most interesting thing you can do is essentially find new verbs. And so that was, I think, the thing I was probably pointing at. The notion that, I don't know, the Vickrey-Clark-Groves mechanism. So this idea that if you change the way in which you vote or allocate resources into this kind of quadratic model, this will help you solve public goods problems. Like that's sort of a shocking set of new ideas. That's an example of sort of some sort of imaginative contribution. That was the point. It wasn't about predicting the future. It was about imagining the future. I think that's kind of the core of it. And so much of the work that's been done on sort of what's been called foresight studies or futurism and various other labels, it's often about prediction and sort of some degree of imagination, but it tends to take kind of the extant objects as being, they're sort of an input to the process. They're not really sort of an object of the process, and I'm talking about making them more of an object. Hopefully that's clear.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely clear that it's the imagination, which I think is really interesting because I think that that's often what gets taken less seriously, or it's easier to wave off and maybe harder to see like short-term value in some of those things.
Well, I mean, the question of sort of how you validate the imagination is a really interesting one. So, one of my favorite examples is Alexei Kitaev has this incredible idea of a topological quantum computer, which is it's founded in a state of matter that naturally wants to store quantum states, and where if you sort of twist it around in the right way, that will result in quantum gates being applied to it. This sort of should sound ludicrous and almost incomprehensible, but it's such a feat of imagination to conceive that this would be possible, and then actually technically to come up with models in which it's very plausible. But it's those models and then ultimately actually building the systems, which is, that's what validates the imagination there. I think something like, The Assemblers, the book, first Engines of Creation, but then the PhD thesis, Nanosystems, did all this sort of interesting validation work showing that it was at least somewhat plausible that you could build these systems and what they would be used to do. So there is, I don't know, some notion somehow of validated imagination there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's true that it's like scientifically grounded, or like maybe it's possible, physically possible. It's
physically possible, and also, and you want some sense of, and there's something essentially new here. Like I gave this example of the topological quantum computer, and there, from the point of view, if you told a quantum physicist 50 years ago that it was possible to store quantum states and protect them in these macroscopic phases of matter, it would have just seemed impossible. It seems sort of ludicrous. Like this is not the way quantum physics works, and yet it turns out that with some sort of caveats, but that's the right way of thinking. There's a surprising, there's a shocking scientific fact there.
And what do you think about this? For example, we used to have the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, and that shut down recently. And I've heard some people talk about like there's the need for a more like macro strategy thinking. Do you think that there's kind of a void for that? And like, if you were to like decide that, we're going to try to do something that works on this, like imagining the future, and let's say you got $100 million or something, what would you do? Sort of, what would be the best course of action, do you think?
So I got $100 million to do what? Exactly.
To basically like put this idea into action of like a serious discipline of imagining the future, that we need that.
Around this specific sort of idea of, imagining future objects, future entities.
Yeah, I could see it. I mean, with the macro strategy point, maybe those should be kept separate, because they
Yeah.
could be just like the imagining is one thing and macro strategies and, seems actually like something else where you.
Interesting. I just think about sort of where these ideas have tended to come from, and usually they've come from people, who are deeply embedded in particular disciplines. Fairly early, arguably the first paper about AI, is Turing about sort of 1950-ish. What I'm getting at is this type of work, it tends to be sort of deeply grounded in particular fields, but then also to be somewhat anomalous within those fields. There's very few papers. So there's this sort of a few strange papers by Richard Feynman and David Deutsch and Richard Josser and a few others about sort of essentially proposing what a quantum computer is. And then once you've got the model, sort of normal science sort of takes over, and other people with very similar training develop the idea further, but they're not for the most part conceiving of fundamental new affordances. I suppose they are a little bit. Well, certainly it's a strange type of work. What I'm getting at is when it's sort of very distributed and very embedded in sort of a deep understanding of particular parts of the world, it's actually hard to see. I suppose the idea that I still quite like is probably sort of some sort of a vision prize where you just solicit sort of vision papers of this type. God knows how you get judges who are broad enough to actually judge this sort of well. And you wouldn't be looking for the flashiest sort of outcome or the most flashy sounding sort of possibility. You'd be rather looking for sort of depth and surprise somehow, which is the thing. If I think, actually a good example, I've given things like topological quantum computers as an example of something that's surprising. An even more surprising thing, I think, is something like public key cryptography, which just sounds impossible. You should have to exchange key material to be able to communicate privately. And yet it turns out that if you understand sort of one-way functions and related ideas sufficiently well, no, actually it's not required. So that just there's a sense of shock there. This ought to be, your first thought when you hear about public key cryptography is, I can prove that's impossible. And then followed by, oh, and here's how it works. It's just amazing. Actually, there's an interesting connection to nanotechnology. Ralph Merkle, I guess, is one of the inventors of public key cryptography, and he's also one of the pioneers of modern nanotech. Actually, that's interesting that he did both those things. I mean, because they're very different at some level. Interesting thing that he's done both. Maybe I'm empirically observing that I was wrong before in my statement about the depth of embedding into particular disciplines. Maybe Merkel's a counterexample.
I don't know. I think that interdisciplinariness is in general like an interesting point, or that's at least at Foresight uh, we often note that breakthroughs seem to come from interdisciplinary crossover, and maybe especially now, I think that's also, isn't that one of the like sort of in AI for science as well? That's what I've heard from like paper QA and these sort of things, that they want to be able to sort of translate between the disciplines, because there's a lot of information may not have been translated between, and that's maybe where a lot of like low-hanging fruit could be now for scientific discovery.
I'm very interested in this, what I call vision papers. So when people do sketch out, molecular assemblers, or they do sketch out quantum computers or whatnot, those papers do often read quite strangely, and they sort of stick out a little bit in the scientific literature. They often had a very hard time getting published. Not always, but that seems to be a very common feature. And I think it's because they're not normal science in sort of the conventional, they're proposing some imaginary future object and saying it will have these properties. Sort of more or less well defined. Sometimes it's very well defined. I think Turing's paper on programmable computers is very clearly defined. Sometimes it's very vague. Alan Kay has this lovely paper about the Dynabook, which is sort of essentially, it's like a much improved iPad from the 1970s. But it's quite a vague paper. Nobody would know anything about that paper if Kay hadn't then gone and actually done a whole ton of it. But the question of how you create sort of a venue for that, and how you make it into a serious, like what's the right standards sort of normatively there? I suspect a lot of people, I mean, those papers often have zero impact for a long time. Not always, but surprisingly often. So I don't quite know what to do about that. I mean, maybe that's part of the point of the, as I say, sort of if you have sort of a vision prize and you solicit sort of ideas, you're creating a little bit of a sort of a venue for it and some sort of normative standards around it. And they're not necessarily going to be appropriate for everybody, but if they're appropriate for some people, maybe then they sort of start to set it just becomes a venue for conversation about interesting goals that people didn't formerly have. Yeah, I suppose actually, I mean, in some sense, the computer science community does this a little bit. I'm thinking about things like the programming language community, where a lot of that, much of the most interesting work is about finding new fundamental abstractions which can be used to control computers. And so there's a little bit of that feeling. Although even there, much of the work that's done, it's just let's figure out how to improve our type system a little bit or whatever, sort of very technical, sort of incremental work, very interesting. But I'm just sort of riffing and not really making much progress, I'm afraid.
I think that's been my experience also with the vision paper. I think is really interesting, but I think what you say is true on like almost who would be the judge. You know, you would just need someone with great intellectual taste or something like that. And I feel like the judge is almost going to be harder to find than like
Yeah.
ideas.
Actually, Drexler, had a lot of problems, sort of being, I think, supervised, is my understanding, at MIT because, he's not what's he doing? He's inventing a field. And it's interesting the extent to which his advisor, which I believe was Marvin Minsky, did actually supervise a lot of people who did that in different ways, in different fields. Often seemed to be Minsky, I guess, co-invented the confocal microscope, but then his PhD students here, they did things like invented scheme, I believe, and just all these other things sort of across a wide range of different areas. Maybe that's sort of an example of almost a factory for these kinds of ideas.
Yeah, somewhere where it's okay to be more interdisciplinary or more just like inventing a field, apparently, to be very exploratory. Let's try to talk about the tools for thought point. Because you've obviously written about this, but if some listeners are unfamiliar with this concept, do you want to just like explain what we mean when we say tools for thought?
Sure. I mean, the phrase is due to Ken Iverson is his name, from the 1960s. He's the inventor of the APL programming language, and he got very interested in the idea. What was his thesis? It was a notation as a tool for thought. And he was very interested in this idea, which has a very, very long history, that somehow the symbols we use influence the way in which we think, and they influence sort of the expressivity. This is an idea, I suppose it's most often associated with Sapir and Wolf, sometimes regarded as a bit disreputable, sort of the idea that maybe our language influences the way we think a lot. I think if you sort of take a long enough historical view, it's clearly true. Obviously, language was an enormous bootstrapping event for humankind. However old it is, we don't really understand the origins of language very well. And then these sort of apparently related things, it's not quite clear where mathematics comes from or to what extent it's, is it using the same circuits as language? Is it, what's it sort of grounded in? But again, that seems to sort of have expanded our world really dramatically. The ability to build models on paper, it's such a shocking thing. You think about something like the first nuclear weapons. This began as graphite squiggles on tree pulp. It's such a shock. Szilard, I think it was 1933, really realizing that nuclear weapons would work. And it's based, it's not based on empirics. It's based on, there's some empirical input, but, it's fundamentally based on models of the world, which we write down with pencil and paper. And that's such a wild fact about the world, that we do have these tools for thought. It seems to be true that, I believe it's true anyway, that much of sort of human history has been about gradually upgrading and improving those tools. So, you invent numbers probably just to solve resource allocation problems. You gradually improve your number system. You invent Indo-Arabic numerals, and those enable all sorts of things. And we don't know necessarily successor states going to be found. It's very tempting to think that we've sort of found the, modern alphabets and modern written language and so on are the be-all and the end-all. But almost certainly that's not going to be the case. You think about sort of neural interfaces, and it's not at all apparent what the right way of being sort of linked mind to mind is, but probably much more interesting ways are possible than merely speaking to one another or smiling at one another or, using your sort of facial expressions and body language and touch and so on. But those are all sort of, they're design questions, so both rooted in what's possible in the world, but also something about imagination. A real sort of epiphany for me as a kid growing up was the very first time I ever used a paint program on a computer. It was Mac Paint on a Macintosh. And it was just shocking to have these tools. I could fill something in. I could, create a hatch effect. I could do these kinds of things. And then sort of learning years later that Bill Atkinson, who recently passed away, he'd invented a lot of those tools. It was a pinball arcade somewhere in Cupertino where a particular light effect was used, and that's where he got the idea for the marching ants effect that is to some extent still used today to indicate sort of that you've selected a region. These are all kinds of, we see these being done in the external world and then start to internalize them. And as you internalize them, they change the way you think about them. They change the thoughts that you can have. To your point, I wish I could talk better about this. I'm a few years out of date, actually. I just haven't really been thinking that much about it. But It is very difficult to talk about.
For some reason it is, but I recommend people read more because you have a bunch of posts about it on your blog.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm to some extent asking you the same question because it almost feels like a hyperentity question again. But like, if you think about tools for thought, are there any that you think would be like really high leverage for creating a better future if we were able to like have them and integrate them more broadly? Or are there
not really? Nothing that comes to mind.
No.
I suppose I am, historically pretty interested in the connections between sort of capitalism and the changed nature of society. So the invention of medium of exchange seems to have, obviously it's had a huge impact on the economy, but it's weirdly also had this, impact on the ways in which people behave. I guess the Protestant work ethic is probably the best known sort of example of this Max Weber's notion, but it seems to have modulated behavior in lots of other ways. There's this, I think it's urban legend, no two countries which have a McDonald's have ever gone to war with each other or something along those lines, which I doubt is true, but it might have been true at one point. It's trying to express some idea, though, about the way in which our human behavior and collective behavior isn't just modulated in the obvious economic ways, but is also modulated in other ways by our economic system. And in some sense, certainly I wouldn't say money isn't just sort of a tool for thought, but that's part of what it is. I think that has become more and more clear through work on cryptocurrencies over the last few years, where a lot of those people they're very interested in the question of how does the medium of exchange we use modulate sort of collective intelligence? How does it enable new types of collective action? So in that sense, I suppose it's not an individual tool for thought, but it is certainly not so much. It certainly is a collective tool for thought. So I'm very interested in that question, but I don't have a good answer. I love that things like Protocol Labs has this series of events on public goods and sort of connections with the crypto world. I think that's incredibly interesting. I also think it's very interesting. Vitalik Buterin has this terminology DAC that it's not very explicitly connected to Ethereum yet, as far as I know. But I find it very interesting that he's thinking about ways of, in some sense, economically modulating sort of our focus on defensive versus offensive technologies. That's another potential link, but again, not very concrete.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and it's the funding the commons, the events.
Yeah, funding. That's right.
Yeah. No, I think we'll leave the tools for thought there, but it's a really interesting idea that I think we should definitely try to look closer at, and maybe the best questions don't have any simple answers as well. So I think that I want to try to wrap a little bow around this conversation, because I think the reason I do enjoy reading your posts so much is that I never really know what I'm gonna get, and that's quite enjoyable. I think it's because you're quite, it feels like you're quite intellectually independent, and you don't mind being a bit contrarian, but not out of the need to be contrarian, but more like you don't mind it if it's necessary. So it's this principles first rather than you come from an ideology, which I find a lot of other people maybe are more they interpret everything based on their ideology, basically. So my question for you is is this something that you do consciously, and is this something that you work to uphold? Yeah, do you think that this is important?
I don't think terribly consciously. I mean, there are various specifics about the ways in which it's enacted, which are fairly conscious, but the overall point of view, I trained as a theoretical physicist, and I think that's, out of just an obsession with understanding sort of underlying principles. And then actually, while doing that, at some point you realize, oh, you need to get quite good at mathematics. And probably the most useful thing I ever did for getting better at mathematics was treating books about and papers about mathematics, not really as things to read, but rather as sort of sets of problems to solve. So you see a theorem and you don't read the proof, you try and prove the theorem. And that's I don't know, I mean, thousands and thousands of hours of that. And I mean, that was sort of done as an expression of personality, but I think at least as much done as just out of a sense of, oh, this is the most useful way to get better at this and to understand it more deeply. And then probably sets up a whole lot of sort of habits of mind that then carry over later. I will say, I mean, I've often noticed, I'll be sort of writing a paper or essay, and there'll be a section that I absolutely hate, and that's often a sign of like a real opportunity. Typically what's going on is I'm sort of regurgitating the standard story and realizing that there's something a little bit wrong here, and you sort of tweak and find what is wrong, and then sometimes it will all unravel. And even when you go back and sort of explain the actual point of view that you arrive at, it might not actually be very different than the conventional story. Often there's a lot of wisdom in the conventional story. Somehow it's you've really thought it through and sort of understood it in a way that you didn't previously. But that's, I don't know, it's a compulsion. I'm not sure it's particularly admirable or chosen or anything. It's more inevitable.
It does seem good just in the sense that like there are obviously like a lot of, I think, interesting intellectual communities. Like I think the progress movement recently, or like the effective altruism movement, or these sort of things. And how do you think, because it seems good in order to avoid groupthink, which I think like a lot of these types of communities are at, you sort of end up at risk of this. Do you have any recommendations like on how to like disagree politely or something like that?
Disagree politely. I wish I was better at it. It's funny actually how much of disagreeing politely is down to individuals. So I don't know. I think somebody like Toby Ord, who's one of the founders of effective altruism, or Patrick Collison, who's one of the founders of the progress studies, or Alexander Bircher, who's a key EA person. They're so nice and sort of polite themselves. You can't really disagree in a nasty way with them. I mean, you would feel ridiculous. It'd be like being mean to, I don't know, the Dalai Lama or something. Yeah, maybe that's a good way of describing it, actually. You want to be polite in conversation, have opponents who are themselves sort of exceptionally polite people in many ways to disagree with. I don't always understand. Some people I will find myself provoked, and it will seem to me that they're lovely people, and yet there's something in me that is responding, and I find it difficult sometimes to disagree in a productive way with those people. I think that's usually more an indication of something unresolved in me than it is something about them. Yeah. It's a good question. Something I remember seeing years ago was, I don't even know how you say her name, Camille Paglia, being interviewed, and she was incredibly interesting and she had so many fascinating things to say. But at a few points, she got on the subject of academic English departments, and she had a lot to say about this because she'd spent much of her career in them. And I remember sort of thinking after a while, I wish she'd had better enemies, just in the sense of, like, I got the sense that a lot of the people who she'd found herself opposed to there didn't deserve somebody of her sort of level of imagination and whatnot. I mean, it was a minor point. It wasn't obviously the main thing about her life, but I remember sort of thinking, oh, you want to pick good enemies to sort of do interesting work. I don't mean enemies in a particularly serious way there, but sort of people who you disagree with in very productive ways is somehow very helpful. Actually, it's a lovely thing, I think, about many effective altruists in general. They're just a delightful group of people to disagree with. Such an interesting group in that regard.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's the way we put the bow around it, is like we need better enemies, but also like maybe better friends to disagree with, or just like.
I mean, that's really the right way of putting it. It's I'm certainly not referring to them as enemies, but it was the Puglia. Seeing that interview really had actually a very deep impact on me, and sort of realizing that you do need, it's very healthy somehow to be disagreeing with in very productive.
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit self-advertising maybe about Foresight, but I do think Foresight is a really interesting community in that sense that there will be very, very many different viewpoints at a Foresight event. It's been been my experience, which definitely I think just opens up your range of like what's possible, I think, or like what's plausible, and yeah.
Also, it often feels like a sort of a crossroads in a really interesting way, where there's sort of caravans have set out from many lands to come there and sort of meeting and exchanging views.
Yeah.
It's very interesting in that kind of way. As almost a facilitator, it's almost like I suppose, an Amsterdam coffee house in the 16th century, something like that. A place to bring people together in productive. So hopefully they can have productive disagreements and whatnot.
Well, maybe that's the note that we end on. Thank you so much, Michael.